Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic today. Let's do it. What's a creepy, true story that you think most people don't know about? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
The Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It's a private entity with private stockholders. It prints all the money used in the United States. Its sole goal is to make profits for the private stockholders and has never been audited. They print money, create inflation, and you lose out. Among the many ways they profit on the people. All the money they print, they loan out to banks and government who have to pay back interest, and this is financed by taxes. The IRS is the Federal Reserve's collection agency. This is the greatest theft in U.S. history. This guy had just moved into a new city for business and didn't know anybody. He rented a small apartment after responding to an ad looking for a roommate. After living there for a few months, he started noticing scratches on his forearms. Having suffered from sleepwalking and various sleep problems in his life, he put it down to scratching himself in his sleep, perhaps caused by the anxiety and stress of relocating to a new city where he didn't know anyone. The scratches would fade for a few days, and then he would notice fresh ones. Marks from 4 fingernails running up his forearms. The scratches got deeper and longer every time, and he began noticing them on his thighs, and eventually his stomach. He slept naked. He also began feeling groggy and lethargic during the day, and suffered from terrible headaches. When he woke up one morning to find his sheets spotted with blood, he looked down and found scratches on his thighs that were so deep they broke the skin. He was disturbed enough to visit the doctor, who prescribed him some antidepressants to manage his anxiety and advised him to wear gloves to bed to at least stop the scratching from causing any harm. He came home from work one night to find his door broken down and the local police inside searching the apartment. It turns out that his roommate, who was generally polite but quiet and rarely left his room when he was at home, was a violent serial arsonist who had been testing his homemade chloroform on him. He found instructions on the internet and had been coming into his room in the middle of the night as he slept and holding a chemical-doused cloth over his face and seeing what he could do to him without waking him up. Apparently, he had been keeping a journal recording the strength of doses he administered and the severity of pain applied. He was jailed for a number of horrifically violent Rs where he attacked women walking alone home made chloroform. The police also found souvenirs from each attack in his bedroom. Mother Teresa's home for dying destitutes in Calcutta was run by people with absolutely no medical knowledge. Patients weren't distinguished between curable and incurable, causing a massive amount of unnecessary deaths. The medical care of all patients was ridiculously unsanitary. Then, the irony is that when she got sick, she was flown to some of the best medical facilities in the world by her own wishes. She indirectly killed a large number of people that could have easily survived. Luka Magnotta, Canadian actor and porn star from Canada, who was originally known for posting YouTube videos showing him torturing small kittens. But then last year he posted a video called One Lunatic, One Ice Pick, which showed him graphically dismembering a small Asian man. He cuts off each of his limbs, his head, and then performs S-acts with and eats part of the body. He then mailed the different body parts to political offices in Ottawa, while others were found in Montreal and mailed to a Vancouver school. This creep was on the run for a couple of weeks until they finally caught him. They found him in a cafe, Googling himself. Wayne Nance is super creepy. He was an 80s serial killer who worked at a furniture store. When he was delivering your furniture, he'd make a map of your house to be used when he came back to kill you. He finally escalated to breaking into a home of a woman he worked with. She and her husband managed to kill Nance, even though her husband had been shot and tied to a pole in the basement. I think it's the only recorded case of a serial killer victim killing the killer. They used to go out to Quantico regularly to talk about it. I went to school across the street from his house and knew the kid who lived in it. I only found out about that because my second grade teacher knew one of his victims and showed me bloody crime scene photos. To this day, my sister and I get freaked out when we see a furniture truck at night. Nicholas Contreras. Long story short, he watched his dad murdered in a drive-by, was sent to a boys' ranch, and they tortured him until he died. The adult staff tormented him by refusing his medications, called him a baby, and ignored his needs for medical help. They beat him until he couldn't move and he lost control of his bodily functions. They would then force him to puke, pee, and shit in a can, then make him do push-ups over the can. Then finally he collapsed, and they ordered him to get up, calling him a faker. He said no, and died. And get this, no one involved was convicted of anything. No one served any jail time. No one was punished. My mother and father lovingly raised me as their own. I was given shelter, food, and indefatigable love. Once I got my BA in creative writing, along with a tireless pursuit toward literature, I figured out that I was adopted. When confronted with this revelation, my parents didn't deny it, but they accepted it with a certain defeat. I love and respect my parents too much to judge them for keeping it for this long. After my discovery, I spent 2 long days with my parents unraveling the biological truth of it all. I still feel an unfathomable longing behind the truth of my biological parentage. However, I've accepted that biological parentage takes a back seat to the wonderful parents that put all pride aside and decided to raise and accept me as their own. Most won't see this as dark or creepy, but it's really effing tough for me. However, I've accepted not only my reality, but I've also accepted the fact that random humans took it upon themselves to give a random F like me a chance at a good life. It humbles me so much.
Well, to your point, I agree that I don't think that the story is creepy. I think your parents love you, and it's a true act of love. And you have every right to seek out your biological parents, or, the people who made you. But your parents are waiting for you, and you're lucky.
When my mom was 16, circa 1976, she was babysitting with her friend Barb in a house-turned-apartment building owned by Barb's parents. There were 3 apartments in total, and all of the tenants, 2 couples with children and a single woman who lived alone in the basement apartment, were out for the evening. It was late at night, and the 2 girls were babysitting for separate tenants. There was an intercom system in use in the building. My mom and Barb were talking back and forth on the intercom. Mom was on the first floor at the front door, just outside the apartment where she was babysitting, and Barb was upstairs. They had been giggling about something when Barb said to my mom, "Hey, quiet down, the kids are asleep now." Mom whispered back, "Okay, how's this?" Instead of Barb responding, a man's voice came over the intercom and simply said, "That's much better." Obviously, they flipped their shit, grabbed the kids and fled, called the cops, who discovered that there has been a man in the basement apartment, lying in wait for the woman who lived down there to return home. He did not have noble intentions either. I'm unsure if I got all the details correct or if my mom was pulling my leg, but she's no longer alive, so I can't double check. Still gives me the willies when I think about it, though. In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the 5 senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connected to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, The man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and he has abandoned us," and his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. When my mom was in high school in the small town of Gaylord, Michigan, she had this teacher, Mr. Dewey, who got really close to one of his students in the grade above her, Ricky. He was as interested in Ricky and obsessed with everything he did. This creeped out some kids who told their parents, and the parents tried to get their teacher fired. But of course, he didn't get fired. So Ricky's about to go to college. The teacher, Mr. Dewey, was also the head of the student council, or student government, something similar. So he told Ricky there was a meeting at his trailer one evening. Ricky showed up, but no one was there, except Mr. Dewey. Ricky decided he wanted to leave, but before he could, Mr. Dewey attacked him with a hammer and beat the shit out of him in his trailer. Smashed his skull in. Brutal shit. Mr. Dewey put Ricky in the trunk of his car and drove to a relative's house. Then he went into the relative's house and told them what he had done and that Ricky was in the trunk. Then my mom says, "I don't know if this is true, but it's what she heard. When they opened the trunk, Ricky was still alive. Barely, obviously. So they took him to the hospital, but it was too late." I'm a tour guide in Savannah, Georgia, and I tell this story on my historical and haunted tours, and as far as I know, it's all true. Savannah suffered 3 major fires in 1796, 1820, and 1889. Immediately after each fire, yellow fever swept the city. Stagnant water had collected in the foundations of the buildings destroyed by the fires, breeding mosquitoes and spreading yellow fever. The citizens thought the epidemic was airborne, and the seemingly coincidental and devastating events led many to believe the city was cursed. Yellow fever is nasty. It begins like the flu. Children and people with compromised immune systems would often experience liver failure, resulting in jaundice, hence yellow fever. Ultimately, people ended up vomiting blood, which appeared black and reinforced the belief that the city was cursed and that the infected were possessed by demons. Most who made it to this stage of the illness died, but some fell into a coma, which, by those medical standards, closely resembled death. Because the citizens believed the epidemic to be airborne, they felt it was of the utmost importance to bury the yellow fever victims as quickly as possible. Some comatose victims were mistaken for dead and buried alive. The city of Savannah built over most of its cemeteries, and burial records were destroyed in the fires. There have been instances in recent years in which workers have unearthed coffins with scratch marks inside the lids, bodies with broken fingers, etc. And the creepiest part about it is that there have been outbreaks of yellow fever in the past couple years. There is a Frenchman named Jean-Claude Romand who, starting in the 1970s, fooled his family and friends into thinking he was a doctor. He never actually went to medical school at all, and basically wandered the streets during the day. He had no income as a result of not actually being a doctor, so he lived off his wife's money unbeknownst to her. He also took money from other people who he convinced he had a hedge fund. This went on for 18 years, but then people started wanting their money back. So in the early 90s, he bought a gun and tear gas. First, he beat his wife to death and slept next to her body all night. The next day, he spent with his children, and after he put them to bed at night, he shot both of them. The next day, he drove to see his parents, ate with them, and shot them and their dog. Lastly, he met up with an ex-mistress who wanted the money he owed her. He tried to strangle her and used tear gas on her, but she fought him off. He then apologized and drove her home. He then drove home, poured gas all over his house, took sleeping pills, and set the house on fire. He was rescued by the fire department, and there is suspicion of this being his plan. He took expired sleeping pills, and the way he set the fire made it very noticeable from the outside. He's currently in prison for the murders and is up for parole in 2015. That's a long time ago.